Welcome into the DNVR Rockies podcast, brought to you by Strava Craft Coffee. Remember to use that promo code DNVR20 because when you do, you get 20% off your entire purchase of that CBD-infused, deliciously rich, and potentially life-altering Strava Craft Coffee. I'm your host, Drew Kreisman. I'm the managing editor of DNVR Rockies. With me, as always, is beat writer Patrick Lyons, and we continue with Hall of Fame week. And on this special edition of the DFA Show, we have got a very special guest. You know him as the voice of the Colorado Rockies on your television screens at AT&T Sportsnet, and the host of the Drew Goodman podcast. Who could it possibly be? Well, that's right, it's Drew Goodman. What's going on?
Do you want to know what? I love the name you guys have. And by the way, thanks for having me on, Drew and Patrick. The DFA, because as you guys know, and probably I'll tell you, you don't want to be DFA'd in this business, right?
That's right. Yeah.
It's designated for assignment. So fortunately, hopefully that has nothing to do with my appearance on the show.
We like the alliteration almost. We got DNVR, we got to have the DFA show. We also have DNBA show. So kind of just fit in. And again, yeah, if you're a hardcore baseball fan, you know that's kind of an odd choice for a baseball show, and that's how we want it. We want the hardcore baseball fans in here.
Well, I'm sure you get them because you guys crank it out every day. The proverbial tip of the cap, because that's not easy to do. But you guys are always coming up with new and innovative information, especially even in the winter months when not a lot has been going on, as you guys know.
Right. Well, one of the things that it does allow us the space to do is celebrate the Hall of Fame and now there's a Rocky in there that we get to talk about, another one trying to get in there. And really it allows us just to celebrate the best of the game of baseball, because at heart, we're all baseball fans, I think, first and foremost. And I did want to start there. There's a comment section here. If you've subscribed on YouTube, if you're joining us live, leave some questions. Let's try to keep them on the Hall of Fame topic for today, since that is our subject matter. But I did want to start with you, Drew. We were talking before, Mr. Goodman. I feel like we're going to have to differentiate our Drews now here. We'll see how this goes. But about the most recent thing that did happen, we've told the story many times. We had a big watch party here when Larry Walker finally got the call. But what was that day like for you? What was that moment like for you? And as someone who's been a part of the fabric of the team, really a voice, an extension in some ways of this team, what did that day mean to you?
Oh, it was very special. I remember for a while thinking, man, will he be able to get in? Because there's been this blockade for a number of years. It's finally getting chipped away at with players that performed at a high level that called Coors Field home. So for him to break that glass ceiling, if you will, I thought it was awesome. And then to learn shortly thereafter that he was going to go in with a Rockies cap on, a lot of pride. I mean, a lot of pride in watching him, knowing him, realizing that the right thing was done. There was baseball justice because he is so deserving of being in the Hall of Fame. And so I was thrilled. I mean, I think like most Rockies fans, you kind of put that fan hat on, even though you're a broadcaster and that sort of thing. I was absolutely ecstatic for him and for the organization.
As a guy who grew up on the East Coast in New York State, I'm sure you've probably been to Cooperstown once or twice before.
5 minutes in.
I mentioned I'm from New Jersey. I do that a lot here, Drew.
Yeah.
Harken back.
There we go.
Yeah. I have had the pleasure of being in Cooperstown. I got to play at Cooperstown when I was in college, and I had gone up there as a kid. And then, though I think a lot of your listeners and viewers will get this, I have 3 boys. One's still playing in college, one's done playing in college and has graduated, and I have another one who's a senior in high school, and they all went through the Dreams Park, through that Cooperstown tournament, which is the absolute. I've been to a million tournaments from youth to high school to college, and it's the best one going. And I was there 4 different times with my 3 boys, so I've been there a number of times. It is it's one of my favorite places on earth. It really is. Cooperstown. It's all about baseball. It's a beautiful hamlet with the lake. It's just a special place, even beyond baseball, just from an aesthetic standpoint.
So then, as a father for these 3 boys who've grown up in Colorado, what do you say to them, or what do they say to you when you're going through the hallowed halls and they say, "Dad, I don't see the word Colorado in here once"? What is that like? We know there's great history here in Denver. We've talked about it a lot on the podcast, a lot. But up to this point, we haven't seen that at all.
Well, it was cool to see like the locker, the Rockies locker, and I'm trying to remember back. I think Tulowitzki had some stuff in there. Some other players had stuff in there. I'm sure there was some Helton memorabilia. I'm trying to remember if there was a Brent Maine something or other because of having won a game.
What he won,
yeah. But there certainly wasn't no one was enshrined at that time. It's still obviously Larry's waiting for his day, which hopefully will come later on this summer, along with Jeter, most prominently. But they're baseball players, they're baseball fans, and I think they realized that the Rockies are still in their relative infancy, and for that reason there hadn't been a player in yet. But they, like everybody else, were thrilled that Walker got in. I know we're going to talk about Todd in a little bit, and so maybe we can start populating Cooperstown with some purple.
Yeah, like you said, I'm glad you pointed out the moment too, because it wasn't just him getting in, that he decided to wear the Rockies uniform. And there's been some interesting conversation. We've been doing, prep for an award show about what Walker and Helton meant, each kind of differently for the Rockies, that they don't necessarily have the same legacy, and that maybe Walker doesn't have the same moments where Helton got to go to the World Series. And you can think of him throwing up his arms and all the great stuff, where Walker, it's like, I don't know, maybe the All-Star game and him throwing on the helmet backwards is not quite the same, but I don't know. Walker was the first great Rocky. Does that seem fair to say?
I've never, Drew, looked at it in those terms or thought about it in those terms. And I don't want to give a flippant, cavalier answer, because I think it would be dismissive of some really good players that came before him. I mean,
sure.
Big Cat from the inception, hit 370 in 1993, and he was great in a Rockies uniform. Dante Bichette woulda, coulda, shoulda been the first MVP for the Rockies. And I'm sure you guys have discussed that at different times on your podcast. So I don't want to say he's the first great Rocky. Maybe he's been now, because of his impending enshrinement, recognized universally as the first great Rocky. But the Rockies had some early talent, which enabled them to go to the postseason in just their 3rd year. The Ellis Burks of the world, and the aforementioned Galarraga and Bichette. But certainly Larry Walker's talent was universally appreciated. I'm going to say something now, fellas, that I'm going to repeat when we talk about Helton, and I'll repeat it on my own podcast, I'm sure, if I have not already over the last year and a half. And that is that, for me, we can crunch stats in the new wave analytics and WAR and all of these wonderful new metrics that we have, some more wonderful than others, I might add, and some less wonderful. But how we measure talent, truly measure talent. And the one thing I always fall back on is, what did the baseball playing community think of him, or the baseball coaching fraternity at that level think of a given player? Because they know best. They know best. And if you asked anybody of that era to name, a half a dozen great players, Larry Walker would be mentioned regardless of where he called home. And the same thing will be said of Todd Helton when you ask guys that never played for Colorado, but played against Helton. And certainly, as I said, played against Walker. They know, and I trust and value their opinion more than any others, quite frankly.
I have a story that fits that bill real quick that I think I've told on the podcast before, but when I was very early into my career doing this, I had an opportunity to be on a phone press conference with Tom Glavine, John Smoltz, and Terry Francona, who all went into the Hall of Fame together that year. And so people were asking them all kinds of questions, but I wanted to know that. I asked them about, them getting in, and I wanted to know about facing Larry Walker as a pitcher or as a manager, and they all echoed exactly what you just said. I think he had like a 305 batting average against lefty Tom Glavine. And they all just went, yeah, he was the guy you circled before the game started every night going, we can't let this guy beat us. We can't let this guy beat us. And then half the time he beat us anyway.
Well, the most notable, and that's a great story, the most notable left-hander, because you alluded to this earlier, that maybe Larry's most famous moment for the uninitiated in our sport or the casual observer of our sport is when he flipped his hat around backward in the All-Star game. There you go, against Randy Johnson. Yeah. And so people felt like, and there was also a game where he didn't play against Randy Johnson. Everybody said, oh, he's got the Johnson flu. He's ducking Randy Johnson and that sort of thing. Well, nothing could be further from the truth. Larry Walker hit almost 400 in his career against Randy Johnson. So, again, I think that speaks to people fully doing their homework. And it's wonderful to see when we talk about the Hall of Fame that more and more people who have a vote are truly doing their homework on the various candidates.
You mentioned the Rockies franchise really being in its infancy, 28 seasons, when you've got these organizations that have been around for 100 years plus. And, we talked yesterday, we kind of made the case for Andres Galarraga, how, we think of him as, he's not a Hall of Famer, but he was very good. Well, depending on how you look at the numbers, there are a couple guys ahead of him that if Fred McGriff gets in, or a Carlos Delgado, and maybe even a Jason Giambi, he's in that class in a lot of different ways from the era that he played. 70th all time in RBI. There's a chance that we could be sitting here in another 25 years from now, and there could be upwards of anywhere from some 6 to 8 Hall of Famers that wore the Rockies uniform. Some of them might have only been for a year. Dale Murphy, Jim Leland, Brett Saberhagen, but eventually, going back to that beautiful hall there in Cooperstown, there's going to be people from the state of Colorado that go through, and they're going to see a lot more Colorado. They're going to see a lot more purple going through that Hall of Fame, because there's just such a rich history here in Denver, and it's finally come to fruition now with Larry Walker.
Yeah, I think that's well put, and I also would hope that as we continue to move forward, the locale of where you played, and I'm not talking specifically about Coors Field right now. I'm talking about the fact that, Denver, we all know what a wonderful city it is. And, if people have spent any time here, the whole world would want to live in Denver because of our weather and the scenery and how healthy our community is typically. But it goes beyond that. It's just that, if you're attached to the Yankees, and we get that, you can have, it's like your statistics have been raised 3 notches on the ladder, as opposed to if you played in Denver, or if you played in another Midwestern city. And so hopefully that will become less of a factor moving forward, and will raise the candidacy of some other guys that probably need to have their statistics and their body of work looked at more closely.
Another guy we talked about in that conversation when we were doing our draft was Joey Votto, a guy who doesn't play on one of the coasts, not a lot of postseason experiences, just an extraordinary hitter for a very long time. But Todd Helton is obviously the other guy here in town that people want to know about. Using your own rubric now that we understand it, what did pitchers say to you when you would go up and after a 10, 11, 12, 15 pitch at bat, and then he'd take them yard or hit a double the other way down the line or in the gap. What were the kinds of things, it's PG-13 rated show, that guys were saying about Todd Helton after having to face him?
Well, you could throw your whole arsenal at him and realize I have nothing now that can get him out. And these are, the best of the best. And you did hear a lot of what you said earlier in that you can't let Helton beat you. I mean, if you're going to lose and it's the eighth or ninth inning, don't let Todd Helton hit a double in the gap and that's why you lost. I mean, if he gets on base and you have to pass on him and the guy behind him, wins the game, so to speak, for the Rockies, you can live with that a whole lot easier than you can if, especially during the late 90s through 2005, 2006, if 17 came to the plate, and even later in his career where, because of injuries in the back, I mean, his talents were diminished. He still gave you a great at bat, man. I mean, his OPS of 953, that should be slam the gavel down right there during the Hall of Fame, right?
Right.
So, yeah, from the guys that faced him, it was the, deifying at all times. I mean, there wasn't any. But look at the last game he played at home. Jake Peavy, who had a marvelous career, right? I mean, he had such great respect for him. I know he was proud that he could face Helton in Helton's final game at Coors Field. And we know what Todd did because great players seemingly do great things when the lights are the brightest and he hits the ball out. I couldn't believe it. It's one of the mic drop moments, at least for me in my career watching that. I mean, who does that? I mean, that's the stuff that happens in Hollywood. It doesn't typically happen in real life. One of my favorite lines in baseball is careers don't end like that. Careers end, on a ground ball to short. But listen, Jake Peavy, who was a tremendous player, ultimate respect for Helton, and that's why he was thrilled and said as much after to be a part of that, even though Helton took him deep.
And that's just the beauty of sports there, where if you were to read it in a script, you wouldn't believe that these two guys who basically are wrapping their careers up at the same time, who did battle in 2007 with Helton's squad, coming ahead there in game 163, Peavy, the best pitcher in the NL, winning the Cy Young Award, and yet here they are kind of culminating their careers at the exact same moment. And, tip of the cap, Helton gets the best of it. You can't write that stuff and make it believable. But yet in sports, we see it all the time. It's the wonder of the game.
It's the last bastion of true reality television.
Right.
It is. I mean, when we all sit down and watch an event, whether it's a playoff game in the NFL next week or the Avalanche playing the Kings last night or the Nuggets, you don't know what's going to happen. You don't know what you may see. Who knew Jamal Murray was going to go off for 50 plus on a couple of occasions in that Utah series last year? Who knew in game 2, after disappointing game 1, the Avs were going to score 8 goals? You never know what you're going to see. So I always say it truly is the last bastion of reality television, and it's why we all love sports.
Yeah. Absolutely. A sport I've been falling in love with, by the way, lately, Mr. Goodman. I don't know if you're a rugby guy at all. I don't know how much you know about rugby, but we got great rugby coverage now here at DNVR. They got Colton Strickler on the podcast, whether you're just getting to learn about the sport, one-on-one, 101. He's also got one-on-one interviews with people, but 101 introductory stuff or the in-depth stuff, whatever you want to know. And now is the best time to get in because Infinity Park right here in Glendale, Colorado, is going to become known as Rugby Town USA. Been designated Rugby Town National Training Center, home of the USA Eagles men's and women's 15 teams. They got all kinds of fun people coming in, including Glenn Big Dog Robinson. It's almost like it's like a cross between sports and WWE, but it's very, very real. These guys are phenomenal athletes. And scary, quite frankly. The game's really easy to pick up if you've never learned. There are a couple of wonky rules that you're going to be asking why they keep kicking it out of bounds, but you'll figure it out after a while. It really is a lot of fun. So check them out over there on the DNVR rugby side. It's a fun sport.
Drew, I got my start in Aspen in this business, and the big team in Aspen, one of the elite teams in the country at the time, and I still think they are one of the elite rugby outfits, the Gentlemen of Aspen. And so I got, right there in the center of the heart of Aspen, I'd get to watch them play. And they had, as I said, some elite caliber players, world caliber players. It's a great sport, ultimate tough guys, and they also they also know how to enjoy themselves after they compete against one another.
That seems plausible.
Yeah,
seems reasonable. I assume by that, of course, that you mean that they go and get their studies done at MSU Denver online. They get their very studious. They go to msudenver.edu/online to the leaders in digital education. You don't want to go to someone who's just now figuring it out. You want to be a road runner. Pick up a few extra skills for life. Finish an old degree. Start a new one. Or like I said, just learn something about, I don't know, the history of Victorian England or comic books or baseball. They've got all kinds of classes for you. So head on over there. You might end up in a class with one of these rugby players. Like we said, they're very studious.
Patrick, I see how this show works. Drew does all the wonderful segues, huh? I mean, that was magical, man, how you moved over to that. But good for you. One of the top. Yeah, I know they don't want to be looked at. I don't want to put my foot in my mouth. I know they don't want to be looked at as just a commuter school because they have dorms now and have for a number of years. But Metro State is really well thought of nationally. I do know that for a fact.
Yeah, we remember during the summer camp when Bud Black went over to MSU to watch some of the guys training at the alternate site. He loved his Roadrunners cap. I remember that day on Zoom, and he was so proud rocking his Roadrunners, and he's like, "Does anybody know what the mascot is for Metro State?" The way he likes to throw those trivia questions out there. So he's a big fan of them as well.
Yeah, Buddy's the best, and the three of us know that because, especially during normal times, we're in that dugout, and some of the stuff gets played for an audience to consume at home, and a lot of stuff unfortunately does not. Just some of the casual conversations. Buddy is as witty and as smart as anybody you're going to sit with in a dugout. That's for sure.
Absolutely. It really is a joy. I remember introducing Patrick to him, and he immediately just started quizzing him on stuff and wanted to know everything. Like, he's just among the best. We do have to get to a couple of questions. I love this one because it allows us a little longer to talk about Helton. It comes from DNVR commenter, who also brings another interesting conversation. Liam, all-time great, saying, who do you think getting into the Hall first, Helton or Scott Rowland?
Very interesting question. I know you guys have followed this closely, and I'm going to say, and not just because of who we are and where we are, I think it's going to be close, but I'm going to go with Helton. I mean, I think a lot of people have taken a much closer look at Todd's numbers this year, and he has jumped more than anybody else, at least in people who've revealed their ballots. And I think more than a third have been revealed so far. And Todd has accumulated the highest increase, I should say, in votes from last year. So though I don't think Todd's getting in this year, I think it'll be close. I hope Scott Rowland gets in. And I would think that right now I'd probably say Todd, may be able to, get in slightly before Rowland. Who knows, though? I think they're both deserving, though.
Yeah, they're neck and neck right now at the public ballots, according to not Mr. Tibbs, Ryan Thibodeau, who looks at this stuff. Scott Rowland at about 65% of the public ballots. Todd Helton at about 55%. So both of those guys are on a cusp where I don't have the evidence to back it up. I imagine once you get over the 50% threshold, at a certain point, you're almost a lock to get in. So I think both those guys are at that point where now those voters who maybe were on the fence are starting to realize, hey, you know what? This guy, let me look again. And, I know Drew did it with Scott Rowland, and we talked about Fred McGriff yesterday, and you go, wait a minute. Yeah, no, these guys are Hall of Famers. They might not be in the top 1%, but they deserve to be there.
Fred McGriff, I've never understood that. Fred McGriff should have been in a long time ago in my mind. I don't understand that. And that goes back to something I talked about earlier. You're telling me if Fred McGriff had worn a Yankees uniform or a Mets uniform for a significant period of time, or a Dodger uniform or a Cub uniform, you tell me he wouldn't be in already?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the funny thing is, he did wear a Yankees uniform. He just happened to get traded back when George Steinbrenner was running the team, was trading every single prospect he could get his hands on. But you're right, didn't do it in the majors, and so that's kind of baffling. I think the same thing with McGriff and Scott Rowland is, both those guys, they weren't star players. They weren't. They didn't bring excitement. They didn't bring like a certain kind of swagger. They just went in, checked in every day, did what they needed to do, where it was part of a lot of really great winning ball clubs, and in a sense almost got overlooked because of that.
I'm reminded of a line that Clint Hurdle used to roll out periodically, and as we know, Clint has a lot of great lines and a lot of poignant lines, and one of them is, the enemy of good is great. We want to anoint people great sometimes prematurely. But ultimately, if you are consistently good over an extended period of time, we look back and say, you know what? That dude was great. So in the case of Scott Rowland, for instance, year in and year out, he was really good. And then when you add it all up, yeah, that was a great player. Great third baseman defensively, certainly. Probably, before Nolan, the best defensive third baseman over a significant period of time would be Scott Rowland, and a very good offensive player as well.
Will wants to know, and an OG commenter from the very early days, is there something we can take away from the voting for Walker or Helton now when we're looking a decade or so into the future for guys on the current roster? Somebody had mentioned Nolan Arenado, who may be on their way to Hall of Fame. But do you feel like there's been a shift, a change in the way the voters look at Rockies players?
Well, they're paying attention to metrics far more than they ever have, beyond just home runs and batting average and RBIs. It's far more sophisticated, and it should be far more sophisticated than that. There's something I haven't mentioned that I was always told growing up, whether initially by perhaps my dad, or in addition to my dad, other things I had heard as a kid, and say, well, who's a Hall of Famer? Well, it's somebody who was a dominant player in their era, somebody that you looked upon in their era and you said, hey, he's one of the best players in the game. And that may sound like an oversimplification, but if you looked at Todd Helton, for instance, and said, Todd played 17 years, right? So in Todd's career, was he one of the best players? Well, in the you take his 10-year prime, which is a pretty long prime, and you say, absolutely, Todd Helton, wherever he went, was looked upon as, like we said earlier, the guy you didn't want to lose the game to. He was one of the best players in the game in his era, and therefore, by that criteria alone, he's a Hall of Famer. So to the question, you look now, and the most obvious one, after 8 years in the league of putting up robust offensive numbers and unparalleled defensive numbers and awards, the Gold Glove in all seasons that he has played, Nolan Arenado, without question, is clearly on a Hall of Fame trajectory. I saw it mentioned, I think, by Mike Schmidt. I remember alluding to this, whether it was a year or two ago, when Mike was naturally asked about Nolan. And he said, if he does this for another, I forget what it was, but, I think he said like 8-10 years, he's going to be a Hall of Famer. I have, the greatest of respect for Mike Schmidt. He doesn't have to do it that long. I mean, we've seen guys with careers who were cut short, like the late Kirby Puckett, who ended up becoming a Hall of Famer in a shorter amount of time. Probably, Nolan is, 4 years away from, if he puts together 4 more years that are somewhat similar to what he's done, he's probably reached a Hall of Fame level. I mean, he may not have the counting numbers if somehow his career was cut short after, 3, 4, 5 years. But based on what he would have done for a decade plus, in my mind, he probably already would be a heck of a candidate.
Bonus question. I don't know that I've ever asked this of anyone before, and I'm not even sure I've answered it. But how many more consecutive Gold Gloves is this guy going to win? Everybody, give me a number. I mean,
Well, Drew,
when does it stop?
5?
Drew, it's a great question. And Patrick, I don't think that's outlandish to say 5, because I know it was a truncated season, but I don't know if Nolan was any better for 60 games than we've seen him in the past. And he's had, ridiculous seasons defensively,
Right.
one after another. But I think game to game, and again, I understand it was only 60, but he was remarkably good again last year. So I'm not going to put a ceiling on it. I think Patrick's right. If you said 5 years from now he's still the guy that the standard bearer at third base, I wouldn't challenge that. So yeah, he may be able to win 13, 14 Gold Gloves ultimately.
Right.
Yeah, that's a great point about, a player's career maybe not being at the peak or at the MVP level throughout, but when they were at their peak, how good were they? Like, look at a guy like Andrew Jones, who, again, voters are still deciding on whether or not he's a Hall of Famer. And I think you almost get the inkling that he is, from his big days with Atlanta. The dude, after the age of 30, didn't play over 100 games. So yeah, he stuck around for 17 seasons, but had a relatively short career for the most part. He did, play in the World Series at 19 years old. But I think if you have that compact career, and like you said, Drew, 4 more years kind of doing, more Arenado-like stuff, that'll lock him in. He might not ever get to 500 home runs. He might not even get to 2,500 hits. Don't know. He might not get to 1,400 RBI like Galarraga. But just looking at the guys that he played against in his era, he's undoubtedly one of the top 10 ball players in the game for a decade plus period of years.
Yes. And, the other guy, just going back to that question, the other guy that he has not done enough yet because he hasn't played long enough. He's done a lot in a short period of time, and that's Trevor Story. I look at players when we talk about the ultimate award in baseball, which you guys are discussing and have been all week, the Hall of Fame. I look at first and foremost, does that person have Hall of Fame ability? Nolan Arenado clearly has Hall of Fame ability. Trevor Story has Hall of Fame ability. And now it is, can they continue to compile numbers over a significant period of time where then you stop and go, okay, he's 35 and he's done this for 14 years and it checks off this box and that box. And then you say, hey, this is a pretty strong candidate for Cooperstown. But you first have to have that ability. There are guys that are going to last 15 years in baseball and have, wonderful careers and set their families up for generations financially, but they weren't at a Hall of Fame caliber. They were good players, solid players for a good period of time. But there are very few you can say, hey, this guy can stay at close to this level. You're watching a guy with Hall of Fame ability. Mookie Betts hasn't done it long enough yet. We all know Mookie Betts has Hall of Fame talent. That's obvious. Cody Bellinger has Hall of Fame talent. Hasn't done it long enough. If tragically his career were to end tomorrow, you'd say, oh, man. Troy Tulowitzki had Hall of Fame talent.
Yes, he
Troy
did.
Tulowitzki will never get into Cooperstown. But from a talent standpoint, and boy, he was among the best in the game for a shorter period of time, but he had the talent to get to Cooperstown. Now, does the body cooperate? That sort of thing.
On the flip side of it, you mentioned something earlier about, sort of in the Scott Rowland conversation, being around for a long time and being very good, or sort of your contributions outweighing the sum of the parts. I wanted to ask you about where we left our podcast yesterday, and that's with two men who have helmed the Colorado Rockies. Don Baylor, eventually possibly getting in by a committee, and is Bud Black a Hall of Famer? I think he's got, we talked about it yesterday, maybe a losing record in his career. He hasn't won the big one as a manager, but as a player, as a pitching coach with the Angels, and his tenure that he's been such a great ambassador for the game, I think there's an interesting case to be made about Those two guys. So what's your take on those two Rockies managers and whether or not they belong in some way enshrined in the Hall?
Yeah, Don Baylor had a great career. I mean, Don Baylor had a really good career. I would have to study it a little more closely. At first brush, I would say that Don Baylor, who was a Hall of Fame person, and I'm not just being, cavalier and saying that because he's no longer with us. He really was. I think the numbers probably fall just a little bit short, and that's without dissecting them deeply. That's at kind of a casual glance, and I'm not even literally glancing right now.
Right.
And for Buddy, Buddy had a really, really good major league pitching career. He has been a very good major league manager. He's not right now, and I'm sure if Buddy was sitting here, especially with the humility that he carries, he's not a Hall of Fame manager yet. Now, if we fast forward 10 years and Buddy's still managing the Rockies and the Rockies are able to win a title or two, now you look at it completely differently. But in terms of Hall of Fame respect and Hall of Fame guys, the late Don Baylor was certainly that, and we're very fortunate to deal with with Buddy right now, who's a Hall of Fame guy. But I would say from a numbers standpoint right now, whether it be managerial and certainly as a player, Buddy wasn't a Hall of Fame player. He was a really good pitcher for a good period of time, but not a Hall of Fame pitcher and not yet a Hall of Fame manager, though there's a whole lot of Hall of Famers that would raise their hand and love to play for him because of how he handles a clubhouse and how he handles and runs a game.
Another guy you could probably throw into that group that's got Rockies relations, if the Hall of Fame were to somehow look at guys and who were baseball lifers and say, well, you know what, they managed or they coached and they had a good playing career and they've been around the game forever. And I think eventually we could see something like that. Certain exceptions being made for guys would be someone like Don Zimmer, who, great manager of the Red Sox, we know, came close to winning a championship with them, great coach, had a decent little playing career, and just the contributions to the game. I don't know if you got a chance to, speak with him at all during his time with the Rockies. It was very brief, but I think those baseball lifers, eventually at some point we could see the Hall of Fame maybe, extend an olive branch out to them, because you're right, they're Hall of Fame people, and sometimes the Hall of Fame doesn't always calculate for something like that.
No, and I think it's okay to have a wonderful career and not be enshrined in a Hall of Fame. And one of the things I really admire and love about the Hall of Fame in baseball is they really are careful and calculated in how they arrive at who is the voting body, and I want to get to that in a moment, by the way, but how they arrive at, who is a Hall of Famer. It's not predetermined, hey, we're going to take in 6 every year. If you make it to the Hall of Fame in baseball, man, you really are worthy, because they have they've really done a good job in looking at the numbers and scrutinizing what that individual brought to the game. And there's no shame in saying, hey, like a Buddy Black, what a wonderful managerial career he's had so far. What a wonderful career he's had as a player, but it's not Hall of Fame worthy. I don't think that's in some way demeaning to
right.
To get lifetime demerits because you don't make the Hall of Fame.
Well, and we had a whole conversation yesterday about the honor it is just to make a Hall of Fame ballot once, just to have your name on the ballot. Just to, we were talking about guys like Melvin Mora. It's like, you're kind of weird and you're not surprised he didn't get any votes, but you're like, he played long enough in the game to make a ballot. And, if that was me, I'd hang that thing right up there next to any other trophies that I won. I was on the ballot, didn't get any votes, whatever, man. There's my name right next to Barry Bonds and everybody.
Yeah, I agree. And I have great respect for the Baseball Writers Association by and large. I think that they have, for the most part, really come a long way in doing their homework and looking beyond name recognition, and that's why Larry Walker's a Hall of Famer. It's why it now looks like Todd Helton's going to be a Hall of Famer. I haven't said this yet throughout our conversation. When I would get this question about Helton, especially toward the end of his career, is he a Hall of Famer? Is he a Hall of Famer? Because he's probably the most popular all-time Rocky. And I would always, kind of equivocate and say he's going to be close, but he's probably going to fall short because of the Coors Field, the altitude, conversation that will always be associated with his career numbers. And to see that better understood nationally, and how difficult it is to go on the road when you perform at Coors Field at altitude. And now I believe, as you guys do, that Todd's going to be a Hall of Famer. I wouldn't have thought that going back several years ago, even though I felt like he deserved it. I just felt like he's going to fall short for some of the reasons we touched on earlier, and this Coors Field bias.
For the same reason that he came in 5th in MVP voting in 2000 instead of winning the thing, and
right.
It followed him his whole career. And I even remember during the debate, some people saying to me, well, he wasn't thought of that way during his career. He only played in so many All-Star games. It's not as many as these other people. I go, yeah, he was underrated throughout his career. Let's stop underrating him now. We've all got the opportunity to stop that right now, and to see it actually happening. I'm with you. I'm a little bit blown away.
I was, saying this also. I have great respect for the baseball writers, and especially the ones that really do their homework. And I think more now than ever before do their homework. And this next statement is going to sound somewhat self-serving, but I believe that it should be the voters should encompass other folks that watch the game, and I'm alluding to announcers, whether television and radio announcers in particular, because oftentimes we see more of the home team and more of the visiting team than even beat writers, whose beat writers get more days off and that sort of thing, or a columnist who may catch a dozen games a year when they're coming through and they go, I haven't written a story on the local baseball team in a while. So I would like to see the voting body expand to include others that follow the game very closely. I know that's self-serving, but I believe it. So,
well, no, that's something I think most fans probably don't realize. Like, who actually votes? Who determines on who gets in, who doesn't? They don't necessarily understand the veterans committees and things of that nature. They would probably be shocked that the people who are there for 162 games every single season for decades at a time don't get to vote. Vince Scully has never had one say about any of the players he saw in his 60-some year career. Never once did the Hall of Fame go, Vin, who do you think should be in? That's never happened. And
but if I keep writing for another couple of years, they're going to give me a vote. Like that.
You know what, Drew? I know you're being self-deprecating, but I know, because I'm there every day, and I know that Drew Creasman and Patrick Lyons are there every day. There are people that vote and and now they're being a little bit better on taking votes away if somebody hasn't covered the game in a while. But there were people who were voting that were no longer even covering baseball a while back, and there are still people that have votes that don't cover it on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, I've told the story a couple of times about in 2018 when I just put my head down. I covered 79 of the Rockies' 81 home games, but that was the year also that I gained so much appreciation, because that was half. I did at best half of what you're doing all the time. And I went, and I can't remember exactly the day, but I just was sitting at home during their teams out on the road, and you're calling the game, and I just go, no days off, man. Or maybe it was like the one weekend that you took off. It's like one weekend a season. And I'm like, are you kidding me? I would be dead. Like,
it's a grind.
It's insane. I gained so much appreciation for it. So yeah, the idea that people who go through that grind and are there for all of it and see it that up close and don't have those moments where they can take their mind and maybe watch a little basketball, a little hockey, and get out of it a little bit and come back. Like, totally with you. What do you think about like players and executives getting votes? Or is that maybe a little bit too, they're too close to it. They're kind of involved. Keep it with the people who comment.
Yeah, well, I like, and I think it's fitting that if you're in the Hall of Fame, you have a vote.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's fine. That's an interesting question. I think that, the people inside the game, I've always said that players know best. They know who the best players are, right? And so I don't know how you do it with, so somebody comes up for 30 days and now they're handing out the ballot that particular year so they get a vote. I don't know about that. I don't know if we have to have 50,000 people voting for the Baseball Hall of Fame. But I like anything, I think there needs to be kind of a place where you take a look at who the voting body is and say, okay, how can we continue to improve this? And I think they've done, as I said, they've done a really good job, because they're now looking at players that were dismissed earlier because maybe they didn't have the biggest name or didn't play under the brightest lights. So I think certainly it's heading in the right direction.
As Mr. Kreisman pointed out earlier about Smoltz and Glavine and Maddox, those guys talking about how much reverence they had for Todd Helton. You're right. The players can see how good guys are, and they've got the respect for them. But for the writers and those that actually vote, they have to look a lot deeper. And our buddy Manny Randall wrote a great book last year, Blake Street Bombers, that I think was somewhat of a catalyst for people going back and re-examining Larry Walker's numbers. I think people are starting to do that now with Todd Helton's numbers, because as you said before, Drew, this idea of looking who they played against. If you go back and you look from Helton's first 14 full seasons from 98 to 2011, his road OPS and his road on base percentage was still amongst the best in the game. So, we know the narrative is, but he benefited from Coors Field. Okay, well, let's forget about that. Let's just throw him on the road when, granted, all the other 29 teams get to count Coors Field as their road numbers. So go ahead and subtract that entirely from Todd Helton. And when you look at those numbers, just on his on-base percentage, it was 391, ninth best amongst players from 98 to 2011. So that includes A-Rod. It's better than A-Rod, better than Vlad Guerrero Jr., Derek Jeter, Ichiro, Scott Rowland, David Ortiz, Carlos Beltran, Adrian Beltre. When you really start to dice it up like that, the argument about Coors Field, let's just put that to the side and forget about him, it really doesn't hold much water once you start diving into the statistics.
I think that the more information that is espoused, as you guys do on your show and I've done on my podcast, or when the topic has come up during a game in season, and certainly we'll have plenty of opportunity this year to talk about Todd's candidacy this year, and I look forward to that. And sometimes it's enlightening to people when they hear about, wait, he has better road numbers than a bunch of big name Hall of Famers, Dave Winfield, I think, among that group, that people say, aha. The other thing that needs to be pointed out, in addition to that, folks are realizing how difficult it is to go from altitude to sea level, which we talked about. In the National League West, there are 5 teams, as we know. Arizona is a good place to hit. Dodger Stadium, Petco Park, and San Francisco, AT&T, Globe Light. What are they calling it now? Whatever they're calling it now. Whoever wrote the big check and whatever. Yeah. I'll get it right when we go there. You're talking about 3 of the greatest pitcher parks in baseball, and you are playing each year either 9 or 10 games in that park. So that's 30 games, which is a pretty hefty percentage of the games you're playing at a place where runs go to die, right? Like triples used to go to die in Willie Mays' glove. Well, you're not putting up robust offensive numbers typically at Dodger Stadium or in San Francisco or in San Diego. So that should be factored in as well. And the other thing that is for years frustrated me is it's always about a Coors Field candidate. Now, there have been a lot of them. Larry Walker's going in. Now we're debating Todd Helton. But was it ever discussed about it? How frequently a guy hit a home run if batted on the left side of the plate at Yankee Stadium? No.
Right.
Or the fact that, if you played in Boston, you had that green monster out there. You always talk, we talk about the green monster, but we didn't say, okay, well, let's juxtapose their stats here versus what they did on the road. It's very rarely done.
Yeah. One of the other things, actually, since you're on it, I want to ask you about real quick, because we did this podcast a couple of weeks ago. I tweeted out, the Rockies also play in the wrong division. The fact that they have to go to California 3 times a year, to face those teams all the time. And, they should be playing Arizona and the Texas teams, but the travel, people don't understand. I remember you running down on, it was a couple of years ago, but I think the Marlins were in town, right? Maybe right before the All-Star break. And they were about to leave, and they were going to go back. And for the rest of the season, they didn't have a game outside the Eastern time zone for the rest of the season. And every time the Rockies go on the road, they go to some polar opposite environment. And so I think, again, that's something that you understand that people who don't travel with the team all the time wouldn't necessarily, is the drain of the travel that the Rockies uniquely have to go through.
Yeah, those are all factors that should be mentioned and taken into consideration, as opposed to the easy dismissal of numbers because Coors Field is a great place to hit. Nobody's denying that.
Right. We can all see that part too. we can all. I did want to get, we're going to have, hopefully, slight teaser here, time for more questions another time with Mr. Goodman. But I did want to get this one in because IDJ2 enjoyed the book, wanted to ask you about If These Walls Could Talk. We have talked with you about that before on this show, but want to know how you came to write it and just if you had in your mind these stories that this was going to be a good book, or maybe something you decide later on, hey, I've got enough stories for a book here.
The way that came about, I think somewhere in the recesses of my mind, I always wanted to do a book. I didn't know what it would be about. I actually probably want to do another book at some point in time. And again, I can't tell you what that will be about. I was approached by Benjamin Hockman, who you guys know, who's a columnist with
St. Louis.
St. Louis Post-Dispatch, and was in town. He's originally from New York, and he reached out to me because the publisher that he had done a book with was interested, wanted to know if I wanted to do a book on the Rockies, and that's Triumph Books. That's originally how it came about, and I said, yeah, absolutely. And then to better answer the question, it was a fascinating process, and you start putting, not literally pen to paper. Sometimes it was pen to paper, but you start typing away, and then the part that was fun to do and really interesting where the stories came about is I had a bunch of stories I had to think about and try to jog my memory by talking to other people that I work with and that sort of thing, but also just doing exhaustive interviews with a lot of guys, from the Heltons and the Cargos and the Walt Weisses of the world, and the Dan O'Dowds and Dick Monfort, and putting those on tape. And I did some of the writing, but the bulk writing based on all of those interviews was done in collaboration with Benjamin, who does that for a living. But the more conversations I had, whether it was with Spilly or Huey, and all of a sudden it would, I would remember another story and that sort of thing. And so it was fun to be able to put it on paper again, so to speak, and to see that come about. And I also think for those that didn't get it when it came out initially, it has shelf life, because if you're a Rocky fan, it's not like, okay, well, it just chronicles the 2018 run to the postseason. It spends a good deal of time in a lot of different areas and covering the history and the players and the executives that formulated more than a quarter century of their history.
And it's a great reminder of all the details that surround these big moments, like for anyone who's read the book, the number 64 should mean something. If you followed the 2007 Rockies, the relevance of the number 64, but your book does a good job of telling the story of the young man and just really detailing everything going on, outside the lines when, the team isn't winning every, ball game down the stretch and making a push for the World Series. It's about those kind of down moments a little bit too. And your book does a great job of hitting all those notes.
Well, I appreciate that, Patrick. And what you're mentioning, Clint Hurdle does such a great job of recounting that period of time during that run in 07. And that story, and I'll let you get the book and read about it, but I get, just when you were mentioning it now, you get chills thinking about it. And so listen, even though we began your guys' podcast today talking about the fact that the Rockies are still somewhat in their embryonic stages going into year 28, they've had many moments and some historical ones, and I know it's frustrating for fans. You wish there were a lot more, but there have been some not only great players but some characters that we touch on and some fascinating things that you may not be aware of that we were able to present a little bit in writing. So that was fun.
All right, we got to ask you at least one tough question here before we wrap up. What is your take on these steroid guys? Whether it's guys who we know, have kind of come out, guys who haven't, guys we suspect. Do you think eventually they'll get in? Do they deserve a place? Is that just kind of part of baseball's history and we got to get past it at some point? What's your take on that era?
So it's a great question. It's a fair question. Anybody who's involved in the game, as you guys are, and I am, have wrestled with it, I'm sure, many times privately. Growing up, you learn very early on, cheating should be not accepted. You don't cheat on a test. You don't, cheat. Though we do know that in sports, we've always pushed the boundaries, trying to get better performance, whether it's individual or collective. A couple of years ago with the Houston Astros, that will probably always take place. So to specifically answer your question, I think there's no way of knowing, hey, this guy did and that guy didn't. And I'll use Barry Bonds as an example because it seems pretty clear that he did, whether he ever tested positive or not. But for me, and I know there's been a familiar theme in this show with you guys, if you ask the players that played in that era, the coaches that coached in that era, the managers that managed in that era, and you say, who's the greatest hitter you've ever seen? I answer the same way they do. Barry Bonds. So is Barry Bonds a Hall of Famer? You're damn right he is. And so it's a tough one. There's some unsavory characters in that museum, which we should remember.
Mm-hmm. Right.
There's some unsavory guys. There's some guys that probably held social views and political views that may be way out there that are in there. But in the context of, guys that belong and guys that put together Hall of Fame numbers, I'll just talk about Bonds specifically. Barry Bonds is a Hall of Famer. Roger Clemens is a Hall of Famer.
Yeah, and you've been there with your boys, so it's every room that you go into is a conversation. And so you go, oh, wait a minute, I've heard something about Bonds, I've heard something about Clemens. Well, let's talk about it. And you can still have that conversation, and you can still talk about, well, maybe they crossed the line, and they cheated. It's not like it's just forgotten and brushed under the rug. It's really just kind of the first stage in a much larger conversation about human beings being separate from the athletes.
Yeah, and this will always be the case, especially when there's money on the line. People are always going to push that envelope, and I almost feel more sorry for maybe the guy that never got to the big leagues and was a lifetime minor league guy professional AAA players we all know exist, and many people who are fans of the game don't realize that there are guys that go to AAA every year, and they're 31, 32, 33 years of age. They know they're not going to play in the big leagues, but they're going to, fill out a minor league roster, a AAA roster, and they're going to make 50, 60 grand, nice summer money, and then in the off season, like the guys used to, they're going to have another job. And don't cheat. And then there's going to be some guys that, took steroids and went from being, a 5 or 6 home run guy to a 16 to 20 home run guy. And they got a chance to make some real money and play in the big leagues. They're not Hall of Fame caliber. So the guys that didn't partake in that and maybe didn't reap the fruits of either getting there or making more money, I understand their gripe, and I understand their anger. Sometimes I've talked to players that have that were kind of more fringy players and say, well, if I had used, maybe I would have made, several $1 million because my offensive numbers would have jumped up. But when it comes to the top tier guys, I think almost at some point in time you have to say, hey, what about, when there were amphetamines in the game? Could guys have played day in and day out the way they did if they weren't, popping greenies? Probably not.
So I'll run it by you as somebody who's long been very, very steadfast on this, because I just don't like it. And the other side of it, the guys I think about it, and we've said a lot of their names today. What would make me feel a lot better about this? The Carlos Delgados and Fred McGriffs and Scott Rowlands and Todd Heltons, the guys that, because now we have to say, for the sake of argument, like, we don't know who did and who didn't, but we got to wrap up here soon. So I'll let you finish out on this, but it's just those guys. Now, if they get in, especially McGriff and Delgado, who aren't even on the ballot anymore. And it's like, I feel like in many ways, they weren't thought of as superstars, because during their era, to be a superstar, you had to hit 55 home runs a year, which is like, that's a little suspect now. And I feel like those other guys just inflated during my youth what it meant to be a superstar player. And a lot of guys got overlooked, but that for me would make me feel so much better. I'm like, I'm with you. Let's put in Bonds and Clemens, but can we also put in Delgado and McGriff?
Well, I think they're both Hall of Famers anyhow,
right.
Regardless of whether we were talking about what certain players did or didn't do. And, we said a while ago, I find it inexplicable that Fred McGriff is not in. And it goes back to that Clint Hurdle phrase, the enemy of good is great. I mean, Fred McGriff was really good for a really long period of time. And then you look up the numbers and you said, hey, this is probably Hall of Fame worthy. I mean, Henry Aaron, as you guys know, he never hit 50 home runs in a season, right?
Right. So yeah. Let's take a deeper look at some of those guys whose numbers weren't quite as wow, especially because some of the wow numbers are a little more questionable. And I'm down for the compromise. I think the Hall is still plenty exclusive if we let all those guys in.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Well, Mr. Drew Goodman, thank you so much for taking the time to talk Hall of Fame with us. Really do appreciate it. Everyone, get the book. Of course, it's If These Walls Could Talk. Make sure you find it. Of course, I know you're going to be watching Rockies. I was going to say, make sure you're watching AT&T Sportsnet. It's like, I got to tell this crowd to be watching the Rockies.
No, I think your audience probably knows where to find the games. I appreciate you guys having me on. Like to do it. Hopefully, we get to do this on a regular basis. And if you guys do this on a daily basis, I'm about to finish up my podcast a little later today.
Who you got on? I know you had Tom Green for back-to-backs. He was fantastic. Yeah. Who do you have on this week?
I did a two-parter, and it doesn't always. You guys know this from doing so many podcasts. You don't set out to do a two-parter because I like the long-form interview. And so Peter McNabb, who I worked with when I was covering the Avalanche, was on me last week. And Peter, as you guys know, he's a walking encyclopedia, not only of the Avalanche, but of hockey overall, and he can really tell a story. And so we ended up putting like an hour on tape. So we did that in two parts, and part one is out right now. I always come out with a new one on Thursday morning, basically, and part two with Peter McNabb will be tomorrow, beginning tomorrow, and I mentioned Clint earlier. I'm going to have Clint on coming up at some point in the not too distant future, but I appreciate the listen.
That story that Peter McNabb tells about Peter Forsberg and the rivets on his skates.
Yeah,
you have to listen to that. For any Avs fan that loves Peter Forsberg, you will listen to that.
It is worth gentlemen. It.
That's all you listen to the episode just for that story. And I think we're gonna have a lot more folks listening to the Drew Goodman podcast because it's quality stuff, no doubt about it.
Yeah, Patrick, thank you for that. That was an amazing story, and he is. Well, another show. If I could join you, we'll talk about our favorite athletes. You guys have been here a while. Our favorite athletes, regardless of sport, and at the top of the list for me is Peter Forsberg. I mean, just he was brilliant, and kind of like Tulowitzki. Well, he's a Hall of Famer, but God knows what kind of numbers he would have put up had he not dealt with the foot injuries because he's blowing out rivets and you'll hear that story.
Right. So, yes, actually, to answer some of the questions that have been coming up, I know a lot of people had more questions we didn't get to because, as Mr. Goodman alluded to, we're going to have more opportunities. We're going to make this semi-regular thing. We could keep going on, but we got to let producer Kale Techboy get out of here. We all got to move on to things, and we will have plenty of opportunities to talk more. It's going to be fun.
No, I look forward to joining you guys on a regular basis. You guys do a great job, and obviously I see you guys all the time at the ballpark, but I appreciate you having me on and continued success.
So make sure you're following everybody on social media, of course, at Drew Creasman, at Patrick D. Lyons. It's at Drew Goodman 42.
42, yep.
All right. And, make sure you're following at DNVR_Rockies, subscribing to the DNVR.com so you don't miss any of the written content. Plus, you get discounts on hats and shirts and masks, a bigger beer when you come down to the DNVR bar at safe capacity. Got watch parties going on right now for the Nuggets and Avalanche. Make sure you RSVP for those. Swing on by. Have a fun and safe time with us. Until then, we can only ask that you keep being absolutely awesome out there. I promise you we will keep being absolutely Patrick Lyons and Drew's Creasman and Goodman in here. And until next time, we will see you at the ballpark.